Welcome to another edition of Revive and Thrive. This is episode number 24, and I am your host, Joshua Blum, and today's episode is brought to you by the letter X. And X is a little bit hard to find a word for. I guess as a context for that, if you're new to us, what we've been doing for every episode of this podcast so far is we've been picking a letter of the alphabet, starting from A and working our way to Z. And every episode is centered around that letter and what that represents, how it relates to physician burnout. And so this is a podcast specifically about burnout for physician fathers, basically about giving folks little actionable ideas or steps to take to work on this very large topic and something that affects many, many of us in the medical field. It's not one of those things that I think has been recognized as an issue formally for very long, but it's something I think that people will recognize as been an issue in the field for a long time. Now, if you're a parent, you probably recognize a lot of those things on a day-to-day basis because taking care of children is quite taxing. And put the two together and you have a recipe for sort of working all the time. You come home and you really want to not start your second shift as a parent, but sometimes that is what happens. All that being said, today's episode is slightly different in that what I used for X is I cheated a little bit. I used X because I wanted to have an episode specifically on being thankful, because a lot of the things on the podcast are talking about things that are a little bit more on the negative side. You know, even though we're talking about positive steps to take, there's no getting around that a lot of these things are either tiring, frustrating, and so forth. I mean, the whole idea, when you're up against burnout type of deal is that a lot of it is systemic. There's a lot of things you cannot change about the way, for example, a hospital system works, the medical practice. I'm recording this in the U.S., so the way that the system works in the U.S., whatever country you're in, has its own issues. There's a lot of those things you cannot change. And so the podcast really is centered on, okay, well, where can we create a little bit of wiggle room in things you can change? And most of that's going to be about yourself. However, what we're going to be doing this episode is talking about ways to remember gratitude, remember being thankful for certain things that you do have. And to do this, I used up T. Today we're going to be using actually a Chinese word, actually. So if you speak Mandarin, the word for thank you or thanks is 谢谢. And when they take that word and those characters and they translate it or transliterated into English, one of the ways that it's Romanized is with the letter X. So one particular system of Romanization uses the word X for that xie kind of sound, even though you think it might be an S sound, and you may in fact be right. But regardless, using this particular system called the pinyin system, it's XIE. So yes, I'm cheating a little bit, but if you didn't know that word, next time you walk into a Chinese restaurant, you may be able to use it, or some other place like that. 谢谢 is a handy word to know if you happen to be anywhere where Mandarin Chinese is spoken. What I wanted to talk about today, with that being said, is that when we say thank you to things, the things that we're grateful for, in the U.S. we do this, officially, like, Thanksgiving and things like that. But it's really obviously something you can do all the time. And when we focus on things that are positive and things that we have, it's not like it gets rid of the negative stuff. That stuff is still there. But our outlook determines a lot of things. Let's talk about something that is, let's talk about the parenting side for a second. So let's say, give you an example of bedtime and wake up time are two times that, are quite challenging. I know they're challenging in my household. Let's say it's a weekday. You're trying to get kids up, dressed, fed, and out the door to catch the school bus or to take them to school or whatever. On the other hand, you may also be doing the exact same thing yourself and trying to get yourself ready. Right? And if your kids are anything like mine, they may drag their feet a little bit and get stuck on something. And, time is different when you're a kid. It's the same amount of time, but it means less in some cases. And, kids naturally kind of will get distracted by things, and plenty of adults do that too. But a parent's job is sort of to keep them going and moving. So it's very easy to find the whole process very stressful, and it may in fact be stressful. However, there's a couple of different ways of looking at this, I guess. So you could say that this episode is a little bit about something in mental health that we call reframing, which is an idea that when we look at something, we have a couple different ways of perceiving it. We have a negative way, we have a positive way to make it simple. I mean, there's often a gray area in between where you can kind of see both. But let's just make it simple for now. Negative way of looking at that, getting ready situation is that, why do the kids, why do they persist in making my life difficult? Why can't they just do what they're told? A positive way of looking at it might be they're only going to be young once. There's going to be a time when I may, in fact, miss this. There's going to be a time when they don't need me to help them with this anymore, and that time is going to be soon. Because let's face it, kids grow very, very quickly. With every situation, there may in fact be a flip side of it in terms of how we see it. I'm sure you've all encountered patients, if you do clinical medicine, who respond differently based on their outlook. One of the very first episodes we talked about was that our attitude determines our altitude. How we look at things determines how well we respond to any given situation. So if you look at the situation as a glass half empty situation, it will be that way. If you look at it half full, assuming that that is a good thing and you're thirsty and all that, then it probably will be more that way. So I think the idea is that if you find yourself leaning more towards the negative, is there any way you can shift a little bit more over to the positive? I think ultimately, part of adulthood means conceptualizing that both negative and positive, good and bad, can exist in the same thing. Have you ever seen the symbol, the yin and the yang? Bring it back to a Chinese. This is a Taoist idea. So if you're not sure what that is, it's that circle which has the two halves, but there's a little squiggly sort of S that goes down the middle, and one side is black and one side is white. It doesn't have to be those colors, but they're opposites. But inside the black, there's a little bit of white, and inside the white, there's a little bit of black, which means that, yes, you have these positive and negative, good and bad, light and dark things that exist in the universe, and you can all come up with examples of that. But within the dark, there's a little bit of light, and vice versa. So within every bad situation, there's a little bit of good. With every good, there's a little bit of bad. And so the idea is that when we're kids, we kind of see things in more black and white terms, to bring it back to that. So if you look at kids programming, if there's a bad guy, they're pretty much all bad. Very, very seldom do you start to get this sympathetic villain kind of approach. You start to see more of that as programming is designed for older kids. However, with younger kids, it tends to be much more simple because that's where they are developmentally. Now, you probably know some adults who also are very black and white and cannot perceive that nuance. I'm recording this in 2023. There's a lot of political strife in the country and worldwide, and things have become dichotomized to such a degree that it's like you're for us or against us. That area in between, the gray, that nuanced area is often lost. And so when you encounter those things in day-to-day life, when you feel that pull to choose a side, just remember you don't necessarily have to. It's really up to you. And I think sometimes people will feel pulled to take a stand on something that they really don't feel that strongly about, and then that's one of those things that tends to wear them down. If you feel strongly about it, yeah, obviously go for it, but not everything necessarily needs to be something that is black and white in life. Most things, if you break it down further, actually are a little bit more complicated than that. So flip side of the black and white philosophy, as we're talking about, flip sides of all things, is that life is often very simple if you think of things in black and white terms. As we get older, though, and this is one of those things that, life may have seemed more less nuanced, more straightforward as a child, but as you get older, you see more gray. So the flip side of that is that, we can't re-erase time, but as you see more gray, the flip side of it, the reframe of it, is that you are able to appreciate the good in all. Like there is. You can learn something from anybody. Even dictators read to their kids, maybe. Or may occasionally have a good idea. There's all these different expressions like that, even idiots can say something profound. When you see ththose kinds of things like that, it just recognizes everybody has something to contribute. You can learn something from everybody, even though the overall sort of message or the overall feeling you get from somebody or what they contribute to your life may not be great. But, every dog has its day, right? I think that's a potential reframe. I think one other thing, when it comes to our work, many of us got into this because on some level, there's a desire to help people. When we get into the stage of being burnt out, it's often that gets carried too far and the wellspring has run dry. We're depleted. We have nothing left to give. So we try to give more and more and more, but it's taking part of ourselves. We give part of ourselves and there's how much we lose ourselves in the process. The flip side of it is also to keep in mind that we're often in a position that is kind of unique in the world. I mean, granted I'm a psychiatrist, so people tell psychiatrists stuff that they may not necessarily tell other people, but that's true of like many clinical physicians. How many times have you heard, if you work with patients, how many times have you heard something, well, I've never actually told this to anybody before. In my line of work, I hear that a lot, but it's something that, even if you're not necessarily somebody that talks about some of the things we talk about regularly with patients, you may in fact be delving into things that just don't get brought up in polite conversation or just even stuff with friends. And that's it's a big responsibility, but it's also enormous privilege. And it's one of those things that, it's why we have the responsibilities that we do and the sort of doctor-patient relationship code that we do. That's a pretty unique thing that we have. And you could argue that medicine is not as respected as it used to be. Maybe people in the past were given too much respect and they abused it. You could argue all those things, but it's still pretty high up there, I would guess. And still, I think people recognize that the length of training that it takes to get to that point is a long point. I guess to borrow a phrase, real knows real. It's an important thing to remember. So speaking of colleagues, I wanted to tune you into a podcast that a fellow physician father has created. And it is, I'll be making an appearance on there at some point, but it's called Thank You Notes. And it's a podcast about exactly what it sounds like. The idea is that every guest that is on the podcast is basically talking about thank you. And they are basically writing a thank you letter that they will read on the episode. And so if you are interested in it, please check out Thank You Notes on wherever you listen to podcasts. And it's done by Travis McVeigh. And you can find that information in the show notes. So check them out and give a listen. It's a good show. That's it for this week. A couple actionable things to think about in terms of thinking about gratitude and thinking about thank you. I guess as a closing note, I often do this before I actually go to sleep. I usually take some time to wind down and stretch and things like that. And one of the things that I often will do is kind of do a little rundown of what I'm thankful for in each day. And I started doing that specifically because I wanted to include that aspect of things in my life just as a way to kind of remember it. And I found that there were quite a lot of things each day that I was like, actually, that's something that I was glad that had happened. I was glad I was there to witness that. I was glad that was a part of my life. So there are numerous ways of doing that. That's just something that I've done, but it doesn't necessarily take a lot of time. It doesn't need to take a big effort or anything like that. But just that little mental shift, that little mental reframe, it can often be very helpful when surmounting large obstacles. So thank you for listening. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you next time.